Ladies and gentlemen, because I, Ronnie Howard, broke the Tate-LaBianca case and prevented no telling how many more murders, I've been shot at, assaulted, harassed, beaten, threatened, and it's very likely and very possible that by the time you see this picture that I may be dead.
Anyone that is familiar with the Manson trial knows that the story of how it all happened was essentially broken when Susan Atkins went to Sybil Brand. For those that don't know, in October of 1969, just a couple months after the Tate-LaBianca murders, Susan was arrested and put in jail for a whole other charge. At the time, the police were really looking at the family for a series of auto thefts that kept happening in the area, and a burnt truck in Death Valley got their attention. In fact, a week after the Tate murders, she and others were initially arrested at Spawn Ranch, and later released since the warrant had used an incorrect date. After the first arrest, the group went up to their hub in Death Valley, Barker Ranch. Though, through various things that led the police to them, Atkins and some of the others were arrested again and incarcerated. Initially, it really only seemed that the group was an auto theft chop shop ring until Susan decided to explain it all. Susan ended up in Sybil Brand Institute in Dormitory 8000. According to transcripts, Susan's bed was next to Ronnie Howard's, of which she told Howard she felt, "We are next to each other for a reason." At Sybil Brand, Susan earned the nickname of Crazy Sadie. The other inmates thought that she was a nut. She was seen dancing, singing, and generally way too happy to be in jail. For one reason or another, Susan felt that she could confide in her fellow inmates Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, not about the auto theft charges, but instead of the murders. While in lockup, Susan would tell on multiple occasions her story on the murders. She really seemed to relish in telling others about it, perhaps either as a trophy, or maybe she believed that they would be impressed with her.
She was in jail on the Hinman murder at that time, but they didn't know anything about the Tate or LaBiancas or any other murders. I didn't believe her at first. Every time she screamed, she'd stab her again, and she just kept stabbing her until she stopped screaming. She told me that to stab somebody is better than having a climax. To stab somebody is a sexual release. She said they wanted to do it as something to really shock the world. They wanted to take their eyeballs out and squish them against the walls and really make it gruesome.
In reality, Ronnie and Virginia were horrified and wanted to tell the authorities. As the story goes, Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham were conflicted about telling someone what had happened. In jail themselves, the two women weren't squeaky clean and had been incarcerated in the past. At the time, Howard was in jail for forging a prescription and Graham had a parole violation. The two women had also been call girls in the past. Knowing that snitches were frowned upon, the two were unsure of what to do, but eventually decided to tell someone the truth. About to get on a prison bus to go to court, she was able to briefly get in contact with the LAPD and let them know what Susan Atkins had told her about the Tate case. Even though I've read a few books and watched many documentaries and videos on the case, I never really came across about what exactly happened when Ronnie came to court. All I really know is that Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard both testified at the trial. As a personal anecdote, when I came across the whole rabbit hole, it wasn't until halfway through reading the Manson book by Gwen that I wondered whatever happened to some of these people, and Ronnie was one of them. I always figured that by now in 2020 she probably wouldn't be with us anymore, but probably lived a good life, and unfortunately I was wrong. 10 years after the murder, after Susan told it all, Ronnie Howard passed away. There are two main sources for this information, her Find a Grave profile and the end of Helter Skelter by Bugliosi. Both sources state the same thing, though each have certain details that the other doesn't have. First of all, after the trial, both Ronnie and Virginia were considered snitches. On page 631 of my copy of Helter Skelter, it stated that Ronnie tried work as a cocktail waitress but found it difficult to hold a job. It is stated that she was looked down upon as the Manson Case snitch and had even been beaten up several times on her way home from work. At one point, there was a bullet shot into her apartment through the living room window, and the bullet only missed her head by 6 inches. Apparently, the next day, she had talked to reporters stating that she should have kept her mouth shut in the first place. On September 21st, 1979, Ronnie came back to Los Angeles from Las Vegas. She had gone with her husband and his brother, and according to 2 sources, she was waiting on the men as they got the luggage. Find a Grave states that she was kidnapped by someone who claimed to be a cab driver. In Helter Skelter, Bugliosi wrote that Ronnie had been beaten by 2 unknown men. Either way, the person or men took Ronnie just as her husband and brother-in-law were coming with the luggage. They drove her to 60th and Western, where she was robbed and beaten. Apparently, they robbed her of $400 in cash and $800 in jewelry, and they dumped her in an industrial district, and she later called her husband telling him what had happened. A police report was made, and it was found that she had been beaten with a blunt instrument on her head and thighs. After the incident, Ronnie was described as having suffered from nausea, dizziness, and headaches. She became increasingly lethargic and was taken to Queen of Angels Hospital on September 25th of that year. Ronnie was treated, then released, but on October 1st, she was found incontinent and unable to get out of bed. At this point, Ronnie was taken to Cedars-Sinai, and at this point, her eyes were absent like doll's eyes. On October 3rd of that year, Ronnie Howard passed away at 12:30 p.m. of blood force trauma, brainstem compression, subdural hematoma, and cerebral edema. She was 43 years old. Those that have read about what happened believe that Ronnie was a target of the remainders of the Manson family, since she snitched on what Susan told her. Police stated that her death was not related to the Tate-LaBianca case, though many people still believe otherwise. Ronnie Howard is buried in Los Angeles Oddfellows Cemetery in Los Angeles, California.